Peerless Achilles comes thundering toward the Trojan line, his bright chariot grinding the fine Trojan soil beneath its wheels. Indomitable in his machine of war, how can any stand before him? The line quakes. Men begin to flee. Achilles' chariot comes closer, closer. Then he hops off and starts pummeling people with his sword. Wait, what? This series is brought to you by A Total War Saga, Troy, a brand new strategy game which dives into the legendary conflict between the kingdoms of Troy and Mycenaean Greece. Stick around until after the episode to learn how you could get the game for free. War in the late Bronze Age was chaotic, violent, and very personal. It wasn't the organized phalanxes of classical Greece marching rigidly to war. No, it was something different, something more primal. So let's try to imagine the field of Troy. It was an age of kings, long before the great republics were formed. The field is dusty and rocky, with low scrub and small trees. And it's hot. Blazing Anatolian hot. And in this heat stand thousands of men in bronze. Some of them wear great suits of bronze plate mail, some of them wear shimmering scale. The reek of sweat, fear, and tension fills the air. Each group is centered around a local lord or king, waiting for him to give the signal to charge. It's an army of heavy infantry, heavily armed and armored. There is no mighty host of cavalry, no great mass of chariots, just a few thin carts to transport commanders or convey messages. A shout comes down the line. The Trojans are coming. The men set their shields, while bands of archers, javeliners, and slingers who stand behind them start to loose their missiles. Then, after one final volley, the cry changes. Men start to charge. The two sides slam into each other with unbridled force, and it becomes a chaotic melee of spear tips and slashing swords. Each man carries a large shield that curves in on either side, so he can cover his body and still thrust his spear from behind it. The world shrinks into dust, the ring of metal on metal and the screams of the dying. Even though these are highly disciplined armies for the time, war becomes local. It becomes the band of men you came with, fighting desperately against whoever happened to charge into you. And there, holding you all together, is your local lord, your commander, in their resplendent armor, identifiable from all the rest, even in the haze of combat. And perhaps your commander calls out their commander. And in the midst of this chaos, a duel ensues. Sword on sword, shield on shield. And everyone knows not to interrupt, even though it's never spoken. And when one of them falls, their side might run, because in these battles, morale was everything. And if one side runs, the other will chase them to the last man. But much of that is conjecture, pieced together from the archaeological records we have, and the few written sources that describe war of this era. And one of those principal sources we have is Homer. But what in Homer is fact and what is fiction? Well, this is a question that has plagued us for ages, because some of it is clearly fact, or at least a pretty good rendition. I mean, that thing about people hopping off the chariots to fight in the beginning of this episode is true. But also, it's kinda shocking that Homer got it right, because Greeks in his time didn't even really use chariots in war. And also, I mean, who would ever think chariots were used in that way? Well, you see, Greece isn't a great place for horses, and even less so for chariots. For a chariot to be effective, whether you're ramming them into people or using them as a mobile firing platform, you need pretty flat open ground. But Greece is all mountains and stony plains, so chariots just didn't play the role in warfare that they did in, say, ancient Egypt. So, Greek war chariots at the time of the Trojan War were used more like glorified taxis than anything else. Basically, they were there to get great heroes wherever they were needed in a hurry, and to get them out again if things went south. Now, Homer embellishes a bit and describes the chariots with a bit more grandeur than these ultralight chariots would have actually had. But it is remarkable that he gets this detail correct at all, since his tales weren't written down for almost 600 years after the events they describe. And by that time, Greeks weren't really using chariots in war at all. But then there's the other things in Homer that are just plain wrong, like basically everybody getting a funeral pyre in the Iliad. But that tradition wouldn't evolve for hundreds of years. Mycenaeans were famous for their elaborate burials. And there's also some clear anachronisms. There are a few places that he forgets that this is the Bronze Age, and has the characters using iron tools they couldn't possibly have had. This particular flub I like to call the Starbucks cup of the Iliad. But to make things more complex, there's also a ton of stuff that could be right. For example, Odysseus is described as having a boar tusk helmet. And this is like the iconic helmet of Mycenaean Greece, the Greek civilization during the time of Troy. It's this very cool helmet that's sort of a leather cap covered entirely in boar tusks. And you would have had to take out like 50 boars to make one of these helmets, so they were definitely a status symbol. If you could afford to wear that many boar tusks on your head, you were probably someone important. But by the time of the Trojan War, they had started to disappear, replaced by bronze helms. So would one of the commanders of the Trojan War actually have shown up in one of these things? Well, I mean, Jack Churchill did show up to World War II with a longbow and a broadsword, and it's far from unheard of for human beings to favor ancient symbols of status over practicality. So it's possible. But on the other hand, it's also possible that one of the Homeric poets had heard of these helms, thought they were super cool, because they are, and gave their favorite hero one, even though he'd be 100+ years out of date. Which leads us to one of the biggest and thorniest questions Homer presents us. How big, really, was the Trojan War? Because early in the Iliad, we get a catalog of ships that tells us exactly how many vessels each kingdom sent to the war. In total, he says the Greeks sent a fleet of 1,186 ships to assail Troy, which adds up, if we do the math real quick, to about 142,000 men. And famously, the siege of Troy lasted 10 years. So you figure provisions for 142,000 men for 10 years, even if they're getting lots of them from pillaging the countryside, is a tall order. Not to mention what it would do to their labor force to have 142,000 people just not show up to work for 10 years. But there is an interesting element to this catalog of ships. While it's probably an exaggeration, it is worth noting that the places he says the ships came from seem accurate. They're all Bronze Age cities, including places that had been wiped off the map by Homer's time. It doesn't include the whole Mycenaean world. It even misses out on a few notable settlements. But it's not just an invention of later Greeks. This, in turn, has led some scholars to question if the numbers are more accurate than we might think. They may not be as remotely high as Homer offered, and the war might not have lasted for as long, but they could have been high enough to represent a significant disruption of the Mycenaean economy, and help contribute to its fall not long after this period. But why would it last for so long? Well, if you've read the Iliad recently, you probably remember it mentioning Mycenae, Agamemnon's hometown. And when it talks about his strong walls or well-founded citadel, Homer is referencing something totally true. In fact, the walls of Mycenae were so huge that they're where we get the term Cyclopean from. The walls were built out of giant boulders, and the later Greeks thought that they could only have been built by Cyclops, for how could ordinary mortals ever have lifted them? And since siege technology didn't quite live up to wall technology at the time, really the only way to take one of these massive fortified spots was to starve them out. And since the Greeks were never able to totally encircle Troy and cut it off from the sea, the siege could have gone on forever. And even though Homer never mentions it, there's one last thing I'm sure you want to know. What the heck was the Trojan horse really? Well, I'll tell you. Just kidding, we don't really know. But there's some really interesting conjectures. While some people think it was really just a decoy horse, there's a theory out there that says it was actually one of the first covered battering rams. Another even more interesting theory, however, is that it represented Poseidon, because amongst other things, Poseidon was the god of horses and was often represented by a horse. And you know what one of those other things he represented was? Earthquakes. Yeah, Poseidon was also the god of earthquakes. And so an alternate theory is that the Trojan horse represented an earthquake that knocked some of the walls down and let the Greeks finally get into Troy. Most likely, the truth of the Battle of Troy is lost to the mists of history. But the myth of this battle does provide us with additional insight into Bronze Age war, and it reminds us when studying history, we shouldn't always dismiss myths as totally fantastic, because maybe history and myth have more middle ground than we originally thought. I'm not gonna lie, I've been incredibly psyched about a Total War Saga Troy since it was first announced. And with this being the first time the award-winning series is set in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, exploring all 10 years of the Trojan War from the perspectives of the Trojans and the Greeks, I'm pretty much over Olympus that they're sponsoring this episode. Not only is the gameplay a blend of grand turn-based empire management and spectacular real-time battles, but also, a little like this episode, it fuses the history of the war with exciting new takes on the mythology of the period. Sup, Minotaur? Plus, with a huge campaign map spanning 200 settlements and 8 playable heroes, including Hector and Achilles, playing this game might even make Zeus jealous. And he was there. But most mind-blowing of all, you can get a Total War Saga Troy absolutely free via the link below for 1 day only on the day this video was released, August 13th, 2020. Now that's a deal even Menelaus and Paris could agree on. Legendary thanks to Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Gunnar Clovis, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1 for helping to make this show possible.